Okay, tonight, we're stepping into the quiet streets of a small town, where shadows linger longer than light, and one unsolved mystery haunted the hearts of its residents for decades. It is a cold case that whispered of a dark past no one dared to confront, a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. Imagine walking past familiar houses, knowing that behind one of those doors, a life vanished without explanation, leaving questions that time refused to answer. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Here we explore not only what happened, but why it happened, delving into the fractures of human psychology, the hidden motives, and the subtle patterns of behavior that ordinary eyes often miss. Tonight, we explore the story of Angela Samota, a bright young woman whose 1984 disappearance shook her town. For decades, questions lingered in silence until a DNA breakthrough revealed the truth, finally illuminating the shadows of a dark past and closing a cold case that haunted the community for 30 years. Angela Samota was a young woman whose presence illuminated every room she entered, her smile sincere, her laughter effortless. At 19, she carried a quiet confidence, a sense of ambition that extended beyond the familiar streets of her small town. Her days were structured by classes, part-time work, and quiet evenings spent writing in journals that reflected her thoughtful and introspective nature. Hobbies such as reading novels, sketching landscapes, and listening to music offered a glimpse into her sensitivity and emotional depth. Friends remembered her as approachable, empathetic, and attuned to the moods of those around her, capable of responding with understanding and kindness. Her life maintained a rhythm between school, family, and social connections, a balance that suggested stability, though beneath it lay a subtle yearning for broader experiences and independence. Her family life, while outwardly loving, carried undercurrents of tension and unspoken conflicts. Conversations often skirted disagreements, avoiding certain truths that lingered like shadows in the household. Angela, perceptive and observant, noticed these silences but rarely addressed them directly. Small resentments, unspoken disappointments, and occasional arguments created a quiet strain in the Samota home. Though the household was comfortable and nurturing, these hidden fractures shaped Angela's understanding of human behavior. She developed a keen awareness of the emotional complexities around her, balancing her bright and friendly disposition with sensitivity to underlying conflicts and subtle cues that others might overlook. Palos Hills, Illinois, the town where Angela lived, presented a picture of small-town normalcy. Streets were lined with familiar homes, neighbors exchanged greetings across well-kept lawns, and local businesses relied on long-standing patrons. By day, the town radiated charm and safety, a close-knit community where routines were predictable. Yet beneath this surface, a quiet unease lingered. Streets that felt comforting in daylight could become unsettling at night, the familiar transforming into the unknown just beyond lamplight. In towns like these, crime was not merely a legal violation, it felt personal, a breach of communal trust. The disappearance of one of their own resonated deeply, affecting both individual families and the town's sense of collective security. From the beginning, law enforcement and the community considered only a limited pool of potential suspects, each with psychological complexities that hinted at possible danger. Investigators focused on acquaintances and neighbors whose interactions with Angela suggested jealousy, resentment, or obsessive tendencies. Casual observations that seemed insignificant, lingering glances, minor disputes, or controlling behavior, later aligned with patterns often associated with possessiveness or premeditated harm. Although profiling techniques were not as advanced in 1984 as they are today, these subtle behaviors would eventually highlight psychological warning signs of extreme violence. A perpetrator operating within a small town often masks their intentions behind normalcy, manipulating perception and exploiting trust. Motives varied: envy, unrequited attention, rejection, and deeper psychological disturbances could all converge in a calculated manner. Each potential suspect brought a different narrative, yet all shared proximity to Angela and the capacity to influence her life in unseen ways. Even before her disappearance, signs of imbalance were evident to those paying attention. Friends remembered instances that, in hindsight, carried subtle warnings. A stranger loitering near familiar paths, unusual phone calls, or individuals who hovered at the edge of conversations created a sense of unease. Minor events, an argument, a door left open, a car parked in an odd location, accumulated over time. Angela herself noticed some of these anomalies, occasionally commenting on her unease, though never in a way that suggested alarm. Her sensitivity to these details reflected intuition rather than paranoia. When viewed collectively, these small signals formed a tension-laden environment, hinting that ordinary routines could soon be disrupted by unforeseen danger. Angela's life combined ordinariness with perceptive awareness, an intersection that made her both relatable and vulnerable. Her story cannot be reduced to the mere fact of disappearance. It must be understood within the context of relationships, environmental pressures, and the psychological currents surrounding her. Early signs of imbalance, subtle threats, and nuanced behaviors all contribute to a larger portrait, not only of a victim, but of the social ecosystem in which tragedy would unfold. The intimacy and familiarity of small-town life created both comfort and vulnerability. Everyone knew each other's habits, which allowed behaviors to go unnoticed until consequences became unavoidable. Angela's social interactions, observed through routine expectations, allowed patterns to develop unnoticed. Moments of unusual behavior among acquaintances, lingering gazes, repeated inquiries about her schedule, or subtle attempts to isolate her socially were minor in isolation, but together painted a profile suggestive of control or obsession. Analysts reviewing the case later would note that such minor anomalies often precede more extreme acts of violence, forming a quiet prelude to events that would ultimately shatter the community's sense of safety. By situating Angela within her family, social, and environmental context, the duality of normal life and latent danger becomes clear. The Samota household, the school, the streets she frequented, all seemed ordinary, but contained hidden vulnerabilities. It was within these cracks and silences that conditions aligned for tragedy. Angela's intelligence, empathy, and awareness were strengths, yet they could not fully protect her from the calculated presence of someone intent on exploiting subtle vulnerabilities. The stage was set. Angela Samota, a bright and sensitive young woman, lived in a town that offered both comfort and concealment. Her days unfolded amidst familiar routines, yet subtle signals and minor unnoticed events threaded a quiet tension through her life. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances each carried motives that ranged from harmless to potentially dangerous, their behaviors often overlooked or misinterpreted. In this environment, ordinary interactions masked hidden intentions, and familiar streets could conceal unseen threats. To understand Angela's story is to recognize the delicate interplay between human perception, social dynamics, and latent danger. Her life and the tragedy that ensued reveal the delicate intersection of innocence and hidden malice, exposing the complex psychological web of a small-town murder, where ordinary routines, unnoticed behaviors, and concealed intentions converged to create a profound, haunting outcome. In the days before her disappearance, Angela Samota's life seemed routine, yet subtle disturbances hinted at a shifting world around her. She attended classes, worked part-time, and engaged warmly with friends, though she sometimes appeared distracted, sensing unease. Small overlooked incidents, a stranger's lingering glance, an unfamiliar car parked nearby, or unsettling phone calls, seemed insignificant at the time. In hindsight, these subtle patterns formed invisible threads of warning, minor signals of intrusion and tension woven into her daily life. Though easily dismissed then, they became the first signs in a timeline that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The town, usually quiet and predictable, experienced unusual activity that week, though at first it seemed insignificant. Residents reported seeing an unfamiliar figure walking slowly along familiar streets, someone whose presence felt deliberate, yet inconspicuous. Shopkeepers remembered a customer asking detailed questions about routines and schedules, inquiries that, at the time, appeared curious but harmless. Angela herself received calls from unknown numbers, brief conversations filled with awkward pauses or vague phrases, which she did not mention to anyone. These incidents, easily dismissed in ordinary circumstances, now appear as early warning signs, subtle indicators of a disturbance in the normal rhythm of life. On the morning of her disappearance, Angela left her home as usual, greeting neighbors with her characteristic warmth and carrying out planned errands. Yet subtle anomalies began to emerge. A witness later recalled seeing her converse with a man whose presence had not been previously noted, their interaction marked by discreet but urgent gestures. Another neighbor noticed a vehicle parked unusually close to her path, the driver watching the surroundings with intense focus. Each small observation, seemingly isolated at the time, gradually formed a pattern of intrusion and surveillance. Collectively, these details painted a day layered with quiet tension, overlooked threats and subtle warning signs that would gain chilling significance in hindsight. Angela's last known movements involved a sequence of ordinary tasks: picking up items from local stores, attending classes, and walking familiar streets. Yet in each encounter, subtle irregularities were present. A friend who had met her for lunch noticed her checking over her shoulder more frequently than usual. A clerk mentioned a man asking for directions to a location Angela had planned to visit, seemingly taking note of her response. While no immediate alarm was raised, these details, when aggregated, revealed a pattern of proximity and interest from an external presence. The combination of ordinary activity and unusual observation created an environment of vulnerability, one in which Angela was unknowingly navigating the space of an observer with potentially dangerous intent. As evening fell, Angela Samota did not return home as expected, prompting concern from her family and close friends. In a small town where minor delays were common, initial worry was tempered by the assumption that ordinary circumstances had held her back. Only as hours stretched into night did the gravity of her absence become clear, and reports were made to local authorities. The initial investigation faced challenges from overlooked clues and early assumptions. Personal belongings left behind, the lack of forced entry, and conflicting witness statements created uncertainty. Key evidence, footprints, items suggesting a struggle, or signs of contact, was either not collected promptly or dismissed. These early gaps, seemingly minor at the time, would later hold critical importance, representing lost opportunities in the crucial hours immediately following Angela's disappearance. Amid the uncertainty, some clues emerged that were subtle yet intriguing. A note found tucked in a personal journal hinted at a sense of foreboding, though at the time it was interpreted as mere reflection. Reports of a vehicle seen near multiple locations Angela frequented were logged but not thoroughly investigated. A neighbor's account of overhearing fragments of a heated conversation near her usual walking route was noted, yet the context remained unclear. These overlooked details formed a faint but persistent thread, a clue that would not make sense until decades later, when DNA analysis would reveal the true scope of her interactions on that final day. By the time the town fully recognized the gravity of the disappearance, the pattern of events was obscured by time and imperfect recollections. Witnesses recalled moments differently, timelines conflicted, and assumptions about mundane explanations diverted attention from potential leads. The result was a fractured narrative, one in which each observer contributed fragments, but the complete picture remained out of reach. These gaps would later challenge investigators, delaying resolution and extending the shadow of uncertainty over the community. In reflecting on the day of Angela's disappearance, the sense of ordinariness masks the underlying tension. Every errand completed, every street crossed, every interaction contributed to a subtle choreography that ultimately intersected with the hidden intentions of another. The ordinary and extraordinary existed side by side, each amplifying the other, creating a timeline that appeared simple on the surface, yet contained layers of unseen complexity. And yet, one particular detail, noted only in passing by a neighbor and recorded in a hastily filed report, remained enigmatic. A single object, out of place on a familiar path, would not reveal its significance for decades. It was a clue whose meaning lay dormant, waiting for a technological breakthrough that could decode its hidden story. Until that day, the timeline was incomplete, the full understanding of Angela's final hours obscured, leaving the town, investigators, and loved ones suspended in a liminal space between ordinary life and extraordinary loss. The events of that day form the first chapter in a narrative that bridges routine and tragedy. Each observation, every subtle warning, each minor anomaly contributed to a complex pattern, unnoticed yet consequential. As we transition to the investigation that followed, it is essential to carry with us the understanding that the timeline is more than a sequence of hours. It is a framework of human behavior, intention, and unseen connections, waiting to be fully understood through the lens of analysis, logic, and eventually, the revelations of modern forensic science. When Angela Samota was officially reported missing, the initial response by law enforcement reflected both the limitations of the era and the challenges inherent in a small-town investigation. Officers began with conventional assumptions, often presuming that she had left voluntarily or been temporarily delayed. While these early theories were understandable, they inadvertently diverted attention from critical leads that, in hindsight, held significant value. Observations such as an unfamiliar vehicle parked near her route, or reports of a stranger lingering in the neighborhood, were noted but not prioritized. Minor missteps, delayed canvassing, inconsistent witness interviews, and assumptions about voluntary departure created gaps that prolonged the period of uncertainty. The investigative process, earnest but constrained, underestimated both the subtlety of human behavior and the possibility of calculated malice operating within a familiar community. As the investigation unfolded, officers contended with a fragmented landscape of evidence and testimony. Witness accounts were often inconsistent or contradictory, and physical evidence was sparse. Items left near Angela's usual paths, a notebook, a misplaced object, or a brief phone message, were initially interpreted with caution, their significance overlooked. These early lapses, though seemingly minor, would later prove pivotal once forensic science advanced. The tension between procedural constraints and the urgency to resolve the case underscored the difficulty of navigating a disappearance in which ordinary behaviors masked extraordinary consequences. Media coverage amplified the sense of urgency and fear surrounding Angela's disappearance. Local newspapers ran repeated stories, sometimes emphasizing sensational details or speculating about motives without confirmation. Television segments highlighted anxious residents, broadcasting interviews that fueled both concern and rumor. This media frenzy, while raising awareness, complicated the investigation. Citizens offered tips, many sincere but based on fragmentary observations or hearsay. The town itself became a theater of speculation, where fear and curiosity intertwined, and the line between fact and conjecture blurred. The community impact was profound. Family members, friends, and neighbors wrestled with anxiety, guilt, and helplessness. Parents worried not only for Angela's immediate safety, but also about broader implications for the town's perceived security. Ordinary interactions were now tinged with caution, and familiar streets became spaces of vigilance. Social pressure on law enforcement intensified as residents demanded answers, while simultaneously managing their own fears. The collective psyche of the town became an element of the investigation itself, illustrating how unresolved cases affect both procedural processes and community perception. Multiple theories about Angela's disappearance circulated, reflecting both investigative speculation and community conjecture. Some posited voluntary departure due to personal or familial conflicts. Others feared a random act of violence, citing the presence of a stranger with ill intent. Certain acquaintances were scrutinized due to perceived obsessive or controlling behavior. Each scenario carried plausibility, but could not be conclusively proven. Investigators, the media, and townspeople alike oscillated between hope, fear, and suspicion, weaving a network of narratives that remained unresolved. Dead ends were frequent, leads that initially appeared promising, footprints, reported sightings, or unusual encounters, often dissolved under scrutiny. Forensic limitations of the time hindered analysis, and minor inconsistencies in recollections generated ambiguity rather than clarity. Over time, the case gained the intangible weight of a true cold case. Anxiety, doubt, and conjecture filled gaps left by missing evidence, showing how unresolved mysteries shape perception as powerfully as reality itself. Despite these challenges, the initial investigative framework provided a foundation for eventual breakthroughs. Police theories, though imperfect, recorded critical observations. Witness statements preserved fragments of truth that would later intersect with advances in forensic science. Public attention and media coverage, though sometimes disruptive, created an archival record that kept the case alive in collective memory. These early months illustrate the delicate balance between human limitation and investigative rigor, emphasizing how incomplete investigations can still contain seeds of resolution. Community speculation added further complexity. Residents debated motives and suspects, guided by local knowledge and personal biases. Rumors spread, ranging from the baseless to those informed by observable behaviors, such as sudden aggression, obsessive tendencies, or uncharacteristic absences. Friends and neighbors speculated privately about who might have the opportunity or capacity for harm, creating a parallel narrative to the official investigation. In this sense, the psychological landscape of the town became intertwined with the case itself, showing how collective uncertainty amplifies fear and encourages pattern-seeking when evidence is scarce. From a criminal psychology perspective, the diversity of theories highlights the complexity of human behavior in small-town contexts. Motives rarely exist in isolation. Jealousy, resentment, obsession, and situational opportunity converge in unpredictable ways. Behavioral patterns are often subtle, but can be revealing when considered cumulatively. In Angela's case, minor anomalies observed in the days prior, lingering glances, unfamiliar visitors, or unusual inquiries, contributed to suspicion and also to the initial failure to identify the perpetrator. Retrospective analysis would later show that such subtle cues often precede acts of extreme violence. By the time the case solidified into a cold case, Angela's disappearance had been framed by a combination of investigative gaps, public speculation, and media narrative. Scenarios ranging from voluntary departure to premeditated assault carried weight, yet remained unresolved. Suspense persisted, fueled by a lack of conclusive evidence and the inherent complexity of human behavior. Observers navigated a landscape where truth, rumor, and psychological inference intertwined, producing a lasting tapestry of uncertainty. A final layer of complexity emerged through overlooked evidence. Minor objects, subtle interactions, and unexamined locations were recorded but never fully pursued. These details, though small at the time, would later prove critical when advanced forensic methods, particularly DNA analysis, became available. Until then, every theory remained provisional, every conclusion tentative, and the town lived suspended between the desire for closure and the limitations of knowledge. As the story shifts from community reaction and investigative limits to psychological and forensic insights, the interplay of perception, procedure, and overlooked evidence becomes clear. Angela Samota's case demonstrates how unanswered questions persist until observation, human behavior, and scientific advancement converge. In this convergence, psychology meets investigative innovation, and long-held silences finally begin to reveal the hidden truth. The mind of a murderer is often a labyrinth of contradictions, where ordinary reasoning intertwines with distorted impulses. In Angela Samota's case, retrospective analysis suggests a perpetrator who combined familiarity with careful observation, exploiting the trust and routines of a small town. This individual likely acted from a mix of jealousy, resentment, and obsessive tendencies, all tempered by the ability to conceal intent. The killer moved through social interactions with calculated control, masking violent motives beneath a facade of normalcy. Such behavior indicates premeditation, where cognition governs action, but emotion subtly shapes motive, creating tension between outward demeanor and inner compulsion. From a trauma psychology perspective, acts of this nature often arise from unresolved emotional conflicts, insecurities, or distorted perceptions of entitlement and rejection. Small slights, perceived offenses, or minor social frustrations can accumulate, forming the basis for extreme responses. In Angela's case, interactions with the perpetrator, marked by envy, unreciprocated attention, or interpersonal tension could have been magnified by obsessive fixation. This illustrates the fragile interplay between environmental cues and psychological vulnerability, showing how minor relational dynamics can escalate into life-altering consequences when filtered through a distorted mind. For Angela's family, the unresolved case imposed decades of uncertainty and emotional strain. Each unanswered question deepened their grief, intertwining hope, fear, and doubt. Parents, siblings, and extended relatives struggled to balance moving forward with life, while remaining tethered to persistent trauma. Daily routines, social interactions, and personal milestones were all shadowed by her absence. The psychological toll extended beyond sorrow, influencing perceptions of safety, trust, and community cohesion. Families of victims often face compounded trauma. The initial loss intensifies over time due to the ambiguity and lack of closure, creating a lasting tension that conventional healing cannot easily resolve. The broader community experienced a spectrum of reactions. Some neighbors attempted to maintain normalcy, continuing daily routines while remaining subtly vigilant. Others remained hyper-aware of potential threats, adjusting behaviors and monitoring interactions. Over time, the town fluctuated between partial healing and ongoing apprehension. Shared narratives of the case became a channel for communal anxiety, while the unresolved nature of the disappearance sustained latent fear. In a small town where familiarity intensifies perception, every ordinary encounter could evoke reminders of the unresolved tragedy, reinforcing the collective psychological impact. Decades later, a DNA breakthrough would finally illuminate the truth, transforming speculation into certainty. Modern forensic analysis, applied to previously collected evidence, identified a perpetrator whose interactions with Angela had remained invisible to investigators for 30 years. The precision of genetic science provided a clarity that traditional investigative methods had been unable to achieve, revealing both identity and connection with unambiguous certainty. This revelation delivered profound impact. It restored a measure of justice, validated the persistent concerns of family and community, and provided closure to a narrative that had long existed in suspended uncertainty. Science, in this context, functioned not only as an instrument of resolution, but as a lens through which the psychological patterns, missed opportunities, and latent behaviors of the past could finally be interpreted. Yet even with resolution, the case prompts reflection on deeper questions. Why did it take decades for the truth to surface? The temporal gap emphasizes both the limitations of investigative tools in the 1980s and the subtlety of human behavior that eluded recognition. It suggests a dissonance between perception and reality, a reminder that time can obscure both culpability and evidence. From a philosophical standpoint, one might consider the interplay of moral patience and the inexorable unfolding of justice. In Stoicism, the delayed revelation of truth aligns with the concept of natural order. Events unfold according to forces beyond immediate comprehension. In Buddhist thought, the persistence of latent karma can manifest in consequences that appear postponed yet inevitable. The prolonged uncertainty also mirrors the Christian notion of trial and endurance, where suffering and unanswered questions serve as a crucible for understanding, empathy, and eventual insight. The lingering question extends beyond procedural resolution to human comprehension. How does a mind perceive risk, trust, and relational dynamics in a setting saturated with routine and familiarity? How do subtle psychological cues evade detection? And why does the interplay of behavior, observation, and environmental context obscure clarity for decades? The answers may reside not only in forensic evidence, but in the patterns of cognition, motivation, and moral reasoning that govern human action. It is within this intersection, where law, psychology, and philosophy converge, that the case of Angela Samota gains its profound significance. Even as the DNA breakthrough provided closure, it could not erase the shadows left behind. The spaces once occupied by unanswered questions retain their weight. For the town, for the family, for observers of human behavior, the case endures as a study in vigilance, perception, and the limitations of immediate understanding. It illustrates how the mind of a perpetrator, the subtleties of social interaction, and the patient march of science converge to reveal truth over time. Yet the haunting aspect remains. The psychological narrative, the hidden motivations, and the silent observations that shaped the events of that day continue to invite contemplation, leaving listeners with the unsettling awareness that human behavior often conceals far more than it reveals. Angela Samota's story, when viewed through this lens, becomes more than a record of a crime. It is an exploration of motive, perception, and the intricate interplay between ordinary life and extraordinary malice. The resolution provided by DNA technology validates investigative perseverance, yet it also underscores the subtlety with which human intention operates. Every decision, every unnoticed behavior, every minor interpersonal dynamic contributed to an outcome that was both preventable and inevitable, revealing the profound complexity inherent in seemingly simple circumstances. Ultimately, the aftermath invites reflection on the human condition, how trauma, obsession, and secrecy intersect, and how families and communities endure. Though justice may be delayed, persistent inquiry and scientific advancement can illuminate long-standing uncertainty. Even with resolution, the psychological and philosophical questions linger, prompting caution and introspection in understanding human behavior. Angela Samota's story is a journey through loss, fear, and the patient pursuit of justice. Decades of uncertainty tested not only her family and community, but also the limits of investigative perseverance. The eventual DNA breakthrough provided answers, yet it also highlighted the profound fragility of human perception, the subtle cues we overlook, and the patience required for truth to emerge. What if the darkness we fear outside mirrors the shadows within ourselves? This case invites reflection on empathy, vigilance, and the intricacies of human psychology. It reminds us to remain aware of the unnoticed, to consider the motives that hide beneath ordinary behavior, and to value the persistent search for understanding. If you found this story compelling, please like, share, and subscribe to Criminal Mindcast. Remember, some crimes leave no screams, only lingering questions. Some silences speak louder than any confession, echoing through time and memory. By engaging with these stories, we honor the search for truth and the voices that might otherwise remain unheard. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.